I think it's only fair to start this off by admitting that I am historically a fan of JPEG Mafia. I first found out about him from probably Anthony Fantano reviewing Veteran way back in 2018, I want to say, is when that album came out. I saw him live just 2 years ago on the back of his tour for I Lay Down My Life for You, which I really enjoyed that album. Enjoyed Scaring the Hoes even more. I would say that was my favorite JPEG Mafia release, not just because Danny Brown's on it along with him, but because the beats are fantastic on a few of those songs. I loved a bunch of his work between those two albums. I've never thought that an entire JPEG Mafia project was just like amazing from start to finish, but what was most interesting about his albums is that they are incredibly experimental. And so going into his new album, Experimental Hip Hop, I was really hoping to hear something new, something different, something that would kind of blow my mind. Because with a name like Experimental Hip Hop, you would think it would be his most experimental project yet. And instead, it is easily his least experimental project yet. But in order to explain how that is, we need to kind of unpack the phrase experimental rap. This isn't really going to be a review of the album Experimental Rap, which I think is mid. It's going to be about the title, an exploration of the concept of experimental rap. Now, when I was growing up, rap music was pretty popular on television. I remember watching TRL back in the day. And the stuff that stood out to me the most was stuff that I would have seen as more experimental then, even if it was kind of within a pop paradigm. My favorite rap artists were Missy Elliott, Ludacris, and Eminem. People who are now considered as like, some of the more integral tentpole creators of their era. But a big part of what they were doing was sounding like nothing else on TV or on the radio. And some of that was in a very commercial sense, like Ludacris had these big repetitive hooks that are easy to catch on to. But they had fun, weird, experimental videos. Their songs were about topics often that other rappers weren't talking about. They were doing something different with their flow, with their image, and this made them stand out. And so while that's not what I would think of when I think experimental hip hop, at the same time, hip hop has kind of always been experimental. In the beginning, it was experimenting with a completely new sound, and for the first 20 years, there was no real solid definition of what hip hop sounds like. It was changing all the time. Pretty much any time a new tentpole hip hop release came out, there was a bunch of stuff that was going to sound like it, but then there was also going to be tons of stuff coming out that didn't sound like it. If you were in the 90s, Memphis hip hop was by all definitions experimental hip hop. But now that is a sound that you can define, and if people do the Memphis hip hop sound, you're not going to consider that experimental, you're going to consider that Memphis hip hop. So it tends to be that when we think of the term experimental music in general, it usually means that it's something that doesn't sound like anything else. You can't really put experimental hip hop as a genre category because by definition to be experimental means to be doing an experiment, to be doing something unproven, something that you haven't already heard before. And this is the biggest reason why it almost feels like a slap in the face for JPEG Mafia's new album to be called experimental rap. Because for the first time in his whole career, he's not doing anything new. Everything on this album sounds like an amalgam of things that either he already did on his previous albums or that other artists already did. There's a lot of Ye worship on this album for some reason. There's stuff that sounds like watered down Death Grips. There's stuff that sounds like stuff my friends were making 12 years ago. Shout out Blind Skywatcher. There were like 3 beats on this album that I was like, this is literally stuff that Sarah Louise was doing in 2014. How is this experimental? And it is not even as harsh or chaotic or interesting as the stuff that she was doing back then. So it really left me with this feeling of this is almost like nostalgia for experimental rap. This almost feels like a cobbled together ideas from different artists that have been considered experimental at a time, But this is less experimental than Yeezus, not only because Yeezus sounded more unique for its time, but Yeezus sounds more unique today than experimental rap does. And that was from a mainstream rap artist who was become very experimental over time. I would say that Ye was always doing experiments in hip hop. And even if some of those early experiments created something very mainstream, he never really stopped experimenting with hip hop. And I think it would be hard to say that an album like Yeezus or The Life of Pablo isn't experimental hip hop. But that's still not even really what I think of when I think experimental hip hop. I think of Dialect. Dialect was the band, if you will, the hip hop group that got me into hip hop in a much deeper way. Because while I did grow up with that stuff from the late 90s, for most of the 2000s I was kind of tapped out with hip hop. And it wasn't until the 2007 or so that my cousin had put these Dialect CDs on my computer, and they blew me away. And Dialect, if even just reading their Wikipedia page tells you that they never really fit in with hip hop. They ended up touring with bands like ISIS and post rock and shoegaze bands, and they were kind of seen as this apart thing because their sound was just so different that it did not appeal to most hip hop fans. And they were in this lane before it was a lane that anybody else recognized as something they could drive down. So they also put out a new album this year. And as I was listening to that album, I was also hesitant to consider it experimental rap. And I know that's not something Dialect is chasing. They're not trying to be called that, the way that JPEG Mafia is literally declaring himself the king of experimental rap now. This is a thing he's out there doing. And it's all marketing, but we'll get into why it's stupid marketing in a little bit. Dialect are experimental in the sense that they were doing new things that no one else was doing and creating a new sound. And now they have that sound. Their new album doesn't sound like nothing they've ever done before. It sounds like their previous work, but that whole sound has just never been explored by another artist. So it still reads as experimental hip hop, even though at this point it's not really an experiment, it's a proven formula. It's just Dialect's sound. Now, if you want to talk about an album that came out this year that's actually experimental, listen to the new Elucid album. Elucid has not made another album that sounds like that. I don't know that he's made two albums that sound anything alike. His previous album, The World Is Dog, I think that was the album, that might have just been one of the songs. That album was also very experimental from a couple years ago. So the last few Elucid releases not only don't sound like anything else, they don't sound like anything he did before. That to me is experimental rap. It's doing something that you are not sure how it's going to come out until it is there. I would bet that probably Elucid does all kinds of experimental stuff that doesn't get released because the experiment doesn't work. It's when you find a formula that you think is interesting that you actually put a release together. But if you continue following that formula, it's no longer experimental. And that's where we're at with JPEG Mafia and with Dialect. And again, this is fine. You don't need to be experimental to be good. The Dialect album is good. The JPEG Mafia album is mid, in my opinion. But the weird part to me is not that it's a mid album. I was expecting a mid album, quite frankly. It's that it's called experimental rap while being the least experimental that JPEG Mafia has ever been. Now, when I think back to peak experimental rap, I think of the early 2010s. That was when Clipping came out. Clipping has only made experimental rap albums, not just because they use harsh noise and all kinds of weird song structures and different concepts for every song, but because, again, none of their albums sound exactly the same. They use certain hallmarks that make them recognizable, but none of them are the same. They all have a different theme, they all have a different sound, they all do different things. And more importantly than that, Daveed Diggs actually experiments with his rap. Because if this album from JPEG Mafia had been called experimental hip hop, I would maybe have less of an issue with it, because the beats are still pretty distinct. They don't sound like a ton of other artists. They're still pretty recognizably JPEG Mafia beats. but his flow is the same as it's ever been, less experimental possibly than ever before. He's just doing machine gun triplet flows constantly the whole album. Like he's doing that flow the whole fucking time. How is that experimental rap? Plenty of rappers experiment with rap. Plenty of rappers change what they're doing. I would consider Kendrick Lamar an experimental rapper because Kendrick doesn't use the same flows all the time. He comes up with completely new things to do. He comes up with songs that don't sound like other songs he's ever done, not because the beat is so weird, but which sometimes it is. To Pimp a Butterfly, very experimental rap album that somehow is considered this all-time classic, even in spite of how weird it is. But Kendrick Lamar experiments with the rapping, and JPEG Mafia does none of that. So when I think of the golden era of experimental rap, I think of when Clipping and Death Grips and Kendrick Lamar were all putting out their weirdest stuff. When, you had MC Ride doing really different sounding performances, stuff that challenged what would be considered hip hop, and doing it differently every time. It wasn't just that the beats were heavy and had this industrial influence to them. It's that the structure of the song was something different every time. It was that the vocal performance was something different. You can't listen to a song like Hothead and tell me that anything JPEG Mafia has done as a rapper is as experimental as that in terms of experimental rap. So I know how much JPEG hates being compared to Death Grips, and he didn't deserve that comparison back on Veteran, back on All My Heroes Are Cornballs. Because yeah, he was also doing some like rock-infused, industrial type hip-hop, but it didn't sound like Death Grips. What defines Death Grips is the fact that they have a live drummer playing an electronic kit with fucked up samples plugged into it, and a manic, insane, dissociative rapper who's doing all kinds of new, interesting things. The closest part of Death Grips to JPEG Mafia is Flatlander, doing his sample stuff, his interesting use of samples and really making the songs have more particularity to them. But what JPEG Mafia was doing was having the most massive sample library, the most obscure samples, putting together songs with incredibly esoteric structure and giving us sounds you just wouldn't hear anywhere else. I mean, the Veteran had one song where the beat is comprised mostly of and then the next song is a bunch of pens clicking and like floor stomping, and it just sounded insane. It was hard to parse. It was hard to tell where one song ended and the next began. It felt like this thick miasma of weird stuff happening, and it truly didn't sound that much like Death Grips. He just kept getting compared to them because for a lot of people, that was all experimental rap was to them. They only knew Death Grips and JPEG Mafia. But he was more along the lines of Clipping. And even then, different enough that those two things, while they have collided, they've worked together, they're not the same. And there's a whole world of experimental rap. And again, if we're just using the definition of like something comes out, sounds like nothing else comes out that sounds like it, forevermore. Like, there's been a ton of it. There's been tons of experimental rap going back through the 90s. Oftentimes something is experimental until it's been codified. Like I said about Memphis rap, or something like Paul's Boutique by the Beastie Boys. When that came out, nothing was like that. Now, that's a genre. People do sampling like the way Paul's Boutique did it as a matter of course, because it's just such a good sound. Who wouldn't want to do that? Deltron 3030 is like the first example of like a truly comprehensible sci-fi concept album from hip hop that still feels experimental, even going back to it, because even if there's elements of it that have been cribbed from other projects, it still feels like its own unique thing. Any Kool Keith album, pretty much. You go back to Octogynecologist from 1996 or 7 or whatever, that still sounds experimental. It still sounds weird. That album today sounds weirder than the new JPEG Mafia album sounds today. Because as Peggy himself put it on one of his songs, sounding like one of his mini-me's. Like, he sounds like he's a random person influenced by JPEG Mafia at this point. He's doing JPEG Mafia type beat. And this is where I get into the fact that this is branding. I think this is all deliberate. I don't think he made his least experimental album and called it experimental rap on accident. And I also don't think it's necessarily to be ironic. I think it's purely a branding thing. A lot of genres come into existence when an album is called that thing. Black metal is named after an album called black metal. Open Mike Eagle's first album is called Unapologetic Art Rap, and that's what he's consistently branded his stuff as. I make art rap. In the same way that there was this art rock movement in the 2000s, I'm doing the art rap movement. And there are certain rappers who fall into that category, and art rap and experimental rap are kind of similar. They're kind of in the same ballpark, but usually when people think experimental, they're thinking of something more deliberately left field. Whereas Open Mike Eagle isn't necessarily making the weirdest music possible, he's just making stuff that is very particular, very esoteric. And so it doesn't have like this broad pop appeal, it doesn't sound like it was made for everyone. JPEG Mafia's new album does have broad pop appeal. It does sound like it was made for everyone in the category of people who identify as fans of experimental rap. It sounds like he's chasing a genre classification on Spotify. He's really pulling a Drake with this album. It's 25 fucking songs long. It's meant to saturate the search term experimental rap. It's meant to put him as the face of this genre and codify it so that he is associated with it. It's not really something people go around saying. It's like, oh, I'm a fan of experimental rap. Some people do, but he wants it to be a thing that people look to as, oh yeah, experimental rap, like JPEG Mafia. That's the association he's trying to create. And it's also part of why he goes after other people who are in a similar category to him. Everybody JPEG Mafia starts beef with is somebody that autoplays after him on Spotify, and especially Earl Sweatshirt. And quite frankly, Earl Sweatshirt is more experimental at this point than JPEG Mafia. Because again, does experimental mean make the weirdest thing, or make the loudest thing, or the most abrasive thing? No, it means do something new, an experiment, something that hasn't been done before. And the last few Earl albums, all of Earl's albums, sound nothing the fuck alike. And also like nothing else that exists. There are artists who have come after him who have copied some of the sounds. I would say that some rap songs ended up being really influential, and there's a lot of stuff that sounds like some rap songs now. It all still gets considered, for the most part, experimental rap. But I would say that his next albums haven't sounded like that. Live, Laugh, Love is a completely different type of experimental sound. And so I understand if JPEG Mafia is looking at trying to be the king of experimental rap, he's going to view Earl as, well, this is the other guy who's about, probably more famous than JPEG, but like just a step up. And so if he's trying to climb his fame ladder and get his achievement of king of experimental rap, he has to dethrone Earl and put himself as, when you click experimental rap on Spotify, this is what plays first. That's literally the goal. This is just about making money. Ever since he met Ye, it's been very clear to me that he is trying to sound snipe other people, because that's what Ye does. Ye collects things that are popular and interesting, or not popular but interesting, and he tries to bring it to a new height by putting himself on it, by being the face of it. He wants the association of, well, Ye did it, to be the reason you check it out. When Yeezus came out, everybody was saying, this kind of sounds like Death Grips. Because, yeah, Death Grips was the most praised sound in the underground music, hip-hop, journalism scene. Like you have Anthony Fantano giving 10 out of 10 to The Money Store, and then a year later, you've got Yeezus kind of sounding a little bit like The Money Store, because Ye said, well, I'll just do that, but in a way that more people will recognize, because it's me. And I can use my branding and use my connections to make something like this, but more accessible and with my name on it. And so for a long time, JPEG Mafia was going, oh, I don't sound like Death Grips. And rightfully, he did not really sound that much like Death Grips. But yet, after hanging out with Ye, suddenly on I Lay Down My Life for You, he's almost deliberately sounding like Death Grips, like making songs that do sound like that on purpose because Death Grips isn't really around anymore. And so it's an open lane for him to just say, okay, well, I'll just convert all those fans over to my team. And now he's doing it with Ye, where on this album, in between the stuff that sounds like Death Grips or the stuff that sounds like 2014 SoundCloud music, he's also stealing all these ideas from Ye, particularly stuff that Ye's not doing right now, and trying to say, hey, look, everybody, I'm like Ye 2.0. I'm experimental. All the things you love about Ye, I'm doing that now. So you don't have to worry about him. You can come over here and get it from me. And so he's setting up this kind of shop. He's like, whatever you want from experimental rap, I've got it. Come here. Come to this, come to this lemonade stand. Fuck all that other stuff. I'm the king of this experimental rap thing. But again, I don't think it's particularly experimental. It just sounds like what every other experimental artist has already done, including himself. And it's way less unique or interesting than any other album he's put out, which were sincerely experimental. They sounded new, they sounded different. Somehow this one is the least different. But if you were trying to become more popular, you wouldn't make something new that you're not sure that people are actually going to like. You would make something that is already a proven formula, already a proven success. What he's trying to do is take the term experimental rap and divide it from the idea that it is about newness or about experimentation and codify it as a sound. This is what experimental rap sounds like. You're familiar with this sound. You just didn't have a name for it. I'm giving it a name. I'm solidifying it. This is what experimental rap sounds like. That's what he's trying to communicate with this album. He is trying to say, everything you associate with experimental rap, I've got it all. But again, that's the opposite of what I associate with experimental rap. To me, the new Elucid is an actually experimental rap album. The new Billy Woods from last year was an actually experimental rap album. Both of those albums sound like nothing else. They don't sound like an album that already existed. This one does. So I guess what I'm making this video to kind of ask is, what reality do we want to live in? Do we want to live in the reality where we consider experimental rap to be stuff that sounds like JPEG Mafia, and for that to be just a defined sound that you can keep coming back to? Or would we prefer that experimental rap refers to rap that doesn't sound like anything else, that is doing something new? Because experimental as a genre title doesn't really make sense. It shouldn't be describing something that is consistent and always happens the same way. It feels to me like what JPEG Mafia is doing is more so just like industrial hip hop that occasionally has some gospel songs on it or something. I don't know. Variety hip hop. Like, the word experimental feels wrong, but at the same time, genre titles never make any fucking sense. Post-rock doesn't mean it doesn't exist anymore, Like, it's always a marketing thing. It's always more about creating a category for people to identify with. So maybe what JPEG Mafia is doing makes more sense than calling something experimental hip-hop. Maybe as soon as you put that label on something, you're already diminishing it, because you're not describing the music. You're just describing that it's different. If he takes it and makes it a genre that sounds a specific way, that might make more sense or mean more to an audience to say, oh yeah, I listen to experimental rap, and them to know that you mean stuff that sounds like JPEG Mafia, as opposed to, I listen to experimental rap. Well, what does that sound like? Well, I like this band that sounds like this. I like this other group that sounds like this. I like this guy who sounds like this. If your engagement is just that you like things that don't sound like anything else, you could just say that. You don't have to say, I like experimental music. You could just say, I like unique music. I like music that has a personality, that has even art rap actually is a maybe a better term, because it doesn't refer to one specific sound. It refers to just the idea that the rap is about something specific. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I hate that JPEG Mafia called this album experimental rap, because it's not that experimental, and I love experimental rap. But on the other hand, I don't think it really means anything for him to do that. I don't think it's gonna make anything worse for me. It really, if anything, gave me an excuse to just talk about Dialect and make sure that you all listen to their new album or that new Elucid album that are both much better. Uh, but you know, Peggy, um, pull up, man. The flop era's got to stop. You're better than this. You don't need that much money. What are you gonna do with it? What are you doing with all that money? Just dressing like Van Helsing? Is this just the price of dressing like Van Helsing all the time? Is that it? Is that all this is about? Is how much Van Helsing can I dress like? Do you have like a huge outstanding debt or something? Like, I don't know. I'm an experimental rapper, and in the spirit of the actual, you know, being actually experimental, I don't make any fucking money off of my music. So I can't really get into the headspace of somebody who feels the need to try to make as much money as possible, but also cling on to the idea that you're experimental. Like, just be mainstream. Who gives a fuck? If you're not gonna really make an experimental album, just make a mainstream album. Why do you have to? Anyway, this is the lane he's making. You know, if he wants to bastardize the phrase experimental hip hop, go right ahead. Everything else is bastardized. I don't see why this would be any different. I've been Nova. Thanks for being subscribed to this channel, even though I haven't made a video in like a year. I last year was going to make a video about Jordy Griep, and the recording fucked up, and then I just gave up and didn't do that. So maybe when he puts out another album, I'll talk about Jordy Griep. But I felt like I had to jump on this because it is my wheelhouse. I'm an experimental rapper, not sounding like JPEG Mafia necessarily. I mean, unless you count a couple of my albums that were literally inspired by him, but even then they don't sound like him, because the essence of being experimental is not to sound exactly like the thing that you're, whatever, you get it. I'm repeating myself. Thanks for listening. Experimental rap forever?